Brent Raynes for Alternate Perceptions Online Magazine. It's Tuesday evening, September 5th, 2023. It's a little after 8 o'clock my time, just a lot after 6 for my guest, Daniel Drasin, out in San Francisco.
It's Drasin.
It's Drasin?
Drasin. Nobody gets it right the first time. It's fine.
Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem.
So anyway, Dan, I wrote a book back in 2000, came out in 2019, Johnny Keel, The Man, the Myth, The Ongoing Mysteries. And I just happened to connect with you thanks to a Nancy Talbert before I wrote the book, which was a real blessing because there are very few people who could have told me about being in Point Pleasant back in 1967 and what was going on from their perspective, and been a part of that whole scene there. And of course, you just come out with a book, on paranormal events, a new science of the afterlife, space-time, and the Consciousness Code. And you previously, as a documentary producer for many years, also with your interest in paranormal, Calling Earth, I think came out 2017. And with Tom Coleman, you produced Skull, the Afterlife experiments with a group of mediums over in England, Skull, England. And that was quite an extraordinary thing there. So there's so many areas to cover, but I thought the best thing to do would be to discuss about meeting John Keel and the things that happened there. And we can, that was all paranormal too. and I know that you, in, I guess, early 1967, you and a young lady had seen a UFO in New York over, I think, the Hudson River at the time. Mm-hmm. And so then someone told you John Keel was doing a talk. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'd like to attend.
Right, and the rest was history, as they say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We were up. There's a wonderful medieval museum on the Hudson in Upper Manhattan, mm-hmm. And my friend and I were up there one day and just happened to be looking across the Hudson River at the Palisades in New Jersey, these sheer cliffs on the other side of the river. Excuse me. And I had been a student pilot at the time. And so when I noticed this object that was kind of passing from south to north over the river and it immediately changed direction and moved the other way without slowing down or looping around, it caught my attention. This is obviously no ordinary aircraft. So I was puzzled by this. I had been interested in the UFO question for many years. But this was, I think, my first actual sighting of an aerial object I couldn't explain.
Right.
Anyway, I mentioned it to a friend who told me that John was doing a presentation in New York. So I went and attended it and met him afterwards, and we hit it off immediately. He then invited me to accompany him on a trip to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which was Mothman Central at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think I took a total of 4 trips there, 3 of them with him and one with a man who was the science editor of a TV production unit in New York, who became very interested in what was going on in Point Pleasant. And we had proposed doing a documentary about it, which eventually it was mysteriously canned at the last moment. That's a whole other story. But anyway, I did spend quite a bit of time in Point Pleasant, mm-hmm. Had some interesting experiences, acquired a great respect for John as a researcher. And he was very thorough. He didn't jump to conclusions. He was always very curious, and he had his own particular viewpoint and his own biases, I suppose. But he never took them terribly seriously, and was always willing to open his mind when when new experiences or new evidence showed up. So we became quite good friends, and Uh, okay, well, do you have any other questions? I'm kind of gotten ahead of myself here. Go ahead. Do you have
Oh
any?
no, well, that's quite interesting. The the I know that you had um, the last time you went down there, you uh, science guy from the television station out of New York City, who was they were going to do a doc. They seemed very interested, and then I understand toward the last minute, the word came that it was not going to happen. They pulled the project, which seemed really sad because I can just imagine because you got to talk and meet with quite a number of the witnesses, I think, in Point Pleasant, even had some sightings yourself while there. And this, because years later, there's all kinds of things back and forth. And if only, there had been a documentary back then in 1967, where we could actually see and hear the people on video telling their stories, what a great contribution that would have been. It's
Yeah,
unfortunate.
I was disappointed, but I was also relieved at the same time because
Oh,
it was such an overwhelming experience, and I don't think I was personally ready for the notoriety that might have accompanied that had it been done. The science editor who visited Point Pleasant with me was really keen to do this, but I think that without getting conspiratorial about it, I think the rest of the outfit just considered it to be a little a step too far at the time,
yeah.
and I'll never know, of course, but um, it was what it was, and there were some documentaries done after the fact, a couple of TV documentaries. I actually participated in one, was interviewed for it, and of course there the books and so on, and the feature movie, which hardly did justice to the story, as I
Mhm.
think you probably agree. To me it was kind of a teaser. You never really saw the Mothman. The UFOs were really not featured. It was basically an excuse to hang a love story on it. Um, but yeah, so that's it was what it was. Um, I think that about this experience I had meeting John's friend Joe.
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had told me about that, and you even gave me a copy of the letter, the email,
Oh, right.
in
Yeah.
an email of the letter you got from John Keel announcing that he had spoken with Joe's wife,
Yeah.
and she informing him that Joe had died in July of 1965, and he was in Keel's apartment. You met him in December 15th, 1967, and so there was a problem there.
Right. This was one of the most, I think, interesting days of my life, and I think of John's as well. This was the date that on our previous visit to Point Pleasant, John had been informed by a psychic in the town that, quote, there would be a disaster on the river the night that President Johnson lights the White House Christmas tree. That's all she said. So John and I were back in New York at the time, and we had planned to meet in the evening. And went up to his apartment, and we turned the TV on to watch the White House ceremony and so on, and that was that for the moment. But when I arrived at John's apartment, his friend Joe was there, whom I had not met before, whom John had not seen in years, who had just shown up at his door that evening. He was a tall guy. I'm pretty big, but he was taller than I was. Well built, dark hair, mustache. And the thing I remember most about him was the firmness of his handshake. He was like this army guy.
Yeah.
And anyway, John and I turned on the TV. Nothing was going on. So John and Joe went out to dinner. There was also a UFO conference that evening in Manhattan, which they went to. I simply went back home. When I got home, I turned the TV on, and just as I turned it on, the network feed was interrupted by the news from Point Pleasant that this bridge had collapsed into the Ohio River.
Mm.
So this happened on this very fateful day. And so obviously I got in touch with John the next day, and we talked about it, and he said his friend Joe had gone wherever he'd gone. Subsequently, John couldn't find him. Tried to track him down. His phone had been disconnected. It was very strange that he showed up that one night, and then John couldn't find hide or hair of him.
Yeah.
And until he ran into Joe's wife a few years later, as he mentioned in this letter. And I had heard about these materializations of people who had passed, and I was rather skeptical about it. But I'm not skeptical anymore. I mean, Joe was as solid and physical as anyone you might ever meet, and so I was actually grateful for the experience because it helped me understand things which I later was reporting on in my documentaries.
Yeah, the psychic materializations and those sort of things. And by the way, I wonder if the psychic there in Point Pleasant, if it might have been a Virginia Thomas. I spoke with her on the phone back in '76, and she told me that she had predicted something happening on the Ohio River, and she'd had other psychic impressions too over the years.
I think that's probably right. I remember her name. We thought there was a chemical plant on the river, a Panasonic chemical plant, which I think produced explosives for the military or something like that. And we had assumed that that the disaster she predicted would have to do with that plant, but it turned out not to be the case.
Okay. And I know that one of the stories that Keel describes in Mothman Prophecies is one you also recall. You said you were actually there that day, I guess, in Mary Hire, observing an airplane. At first it wasn't an airplane.
Right. Well, the funny thing, I think the funniest thing was that like we're up on this hill that sort of overlooks the town of Point Pleasant, and we're just kind of scanning around, and it's a beautiful, sunny, cloudless day, except for one little kind of perfect cloud that could have been taken from a child's storybook. It was a very strange little white cloud. And from the distance came this sort of vague oval object, which went directly into the cloud. And when it emerged from the cloud, it was no longer this vague object. It was a small twin-engine airplane, which flew directly over our heads. And it was just an amazing little experience. Like whoever was behind the scenes, kind of tweaking us and playing a little prank on us. But yeah, it was one of those things that you don't forget.
Right. And when it was going into the cloud, was it coming from a different direction than when it came out of the cloud as a plane, or?
It made a straight line. It came from the distance to the left of our field of vision, came into the cloud and continued on the same trajectory when it came out as an airplane. And it had, it sounded like a twin-engine airplane. There's there's nothing strange about it in that way. It materialized like Joe materialized, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Okay.
So what do we know?
Wow. Well, I've been talking to quite a bit recently with Peter Jordan, an investigator, paranormal investigator, and in New Jersey, and he knew Keel. He used to visit him and spoke with him, and he asked him about some of these UFOs appearing as other things, and he claimed that he had seen that apparently more than once in his investigations, and that would certainly be one of those incidents. I remember reading it in the Mothman Prophecies, and then my first exchanges with you described that, and I thought, oh, well, that's the same story he described. So now I've actually spoken with someone who can remember those same details. And wow.
And yes, speaking of airplanes, I just remembered another little anecdote from one of my visits to Point Pleasant. Went across the river to the Ohio side and went to the Gallipolis, Ohio airport and interviewed some pilots there. And one of them is local. These are salt of the earth folks. They don't make stuff up. And pilots, they have a certain integrity to them. I used to be a student pilot. I was part of that community. So I really get this. So
Mhm.
this guy, a local private pilot, tells me, he says, yeah, I was flying along not too long ago by the river, and I saw this thing flying along, and I thought it was a very strange looking little airplane. So I kind of approached it, and it was this flying critter.
The Mothman.
It was the Mothman.
Ha.
And this is a guy who, I wouldn't imagine would make this sort of thing. And he seemed genuinely taken with this experience.
Huh. And
So
that was he saw that in the daytime, I assume.
broad
And
daylight, broad
yeah.
daylight. And there have been a number of sightings of the Mothman in broad daylight, as you might remember.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of them. When I did some research not too long ago, some friends of mine in Boulder, Colorado, invited me there a few years ago to do a little presentation on this experience, and so I did some research at the time, and I found that there were dozens of Mothman sightings before the four teenagers in the car. Were terrified by this thing and reported it to the sheriff and so on. Then that whole chain of events started with them, but that the Mothman had been seen by quite a few other people in the area prior to that.
Yeah. And I know that by 1993, I got a letter from John Keel saying he was no longer really interested in the Mothman, that these kind of sightings he'd found happened worldwide, and he got hundreds of letters from other people from different areas of the country, different parts of the world, um, and in fact, I remember seeing some stories from like 1947 when the whole flying saucer era started up, like out around Oregon and Washington, where people were reporting flying people in the air, with wings. So it's just really very, very high strange. Um, but
Well, we think these things are strange and we label them paranormal.
mhm.
And I sort of I bring a little skepticism to that notion, in the sense that, if we can't talk about these things openly, how do we know how normal or not normal they are? My sense of it is that these things are a lot more normal and a lot more frequently encountered than we might suspect. And by labeling them paranormal, we kind of, in a way, put them in the closet. In my experience, when someone earns my trust and it feels at ease to speak with me, they'll report all kinds of things, and which normally they would be inclined to keep secret. So now that I'm in the business of being an open afterlife researcher and author, I'm finding that a lot of people are contacting me with their stories. I got a beautiful publisher just forwarded me a beautiful little handwritten note from a little old lady in rural Ohio. Last person I would think would be drawn to my book with science in the title. And may I read you this note?
Sure.
Yeah. She writes, Dear Daniel, what a wonderful book, A New Science of the Afterlife. I sit here just finished it with tears, compelled to write you a note. Please forgive the writing errors. Emotions and age has me, 81, just a bit older than you. My one-of-a-kind husband of 60 years, high school sweetheart and 57 years married, lives in the afterlife now 4.5 years. He is with me so often, still with his sense of humor, has apported many things, means manifested physical objects,
Uh-huh.
and have heard my name at odd hours of the night. Your words have opened me to more of his existence. Thank you.
Yeah.
That sort of thing makes it worthwhile. I mean, here's someone who probably has not been able to entrust these words to maybe know anyone else.
Mhm.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say that reminds me of how one experience that was quite interesting, eye-opening for me, was back in 1973 when there were a lot of UFO sightings, and I was in Florida at the time, and there was a woman and a young lady who was married. She was married to a military guy, and her home was just down the road from Jacksonville Naval Air Base. And 2 nights in a row, around the same time, she claimed she'd seen a disc-type object with a ring of lights around it flying overhead. It ended up as a brief note in the Jacksonville newspaper. And a friend of mine, Ramona Clark, who was a researcher and experiencer and used to write to John Keel too, we went to visit this girl, and she told about her sightings. I'm writing it all down. And then Ramona says, have you ever had any other unusual experiences through the years? Just anything unusual? No, not really. Says, but I do. She's saying all of a sudden, she says, oh yeah, but I remember one time I got this weird phone call, and it was a friend. The voice just sounded exactly like this person I'd known who died a few months earlier, and they wanted to come visit me. And she said, I started crying, and I told them, no.
Oh.
and then suddenly, she thought of another experience. She'd been involved like in a seance, and it was like an apparition that appeared. And then there was something else about being in a graveyard, and a bird was following around, and or maybe that was. But anyway, the point was that she normally didn't dwell on this, that just being asked that question, we were there to talk to her about UFOs, and this brought up all these other stories. And of course, Keel found that, when you follow up on these stories, you may find that these people are experiencing a whole lot more than just having this one single experience. And how many investigators over the years have just gone to follow up on that one story, say a flying saucer flew over their house, and they didn't bother to ask, and find out maybe there was a Bigfoot. If they said, oh, there was a Bigfoot in our yard the next day, well, I'm not here for that. That's.
Well, yeah, that's, that's when someone has already had a so-called paranormal experience that they're willing to talk about, they may be, open to other questions. What I wonder is all the people who haven't been asked.
Right. Yeah. Right. I know this Albert Rosales lives down in Miami, Florida. He's been collecting thousands of reports from around the world, from different publications, sometimes direct correspondence. He's on Facebook, and he, we were talking, and I says, all these sensational cases of landings and beings and stuff that you've collected, I wonder if the investigators was to, a lot of those cases that hit the newspapers or the magazines or the books, if there was a whole lot more in the background to a lot of those stories than just that one that was focused upon, the report of alien occupants, whatever. Because again, when you actually do meet these people, the rule is there's more than that one story there. There's a potential whole lifetime of experiences. And I know this, they're having these UFO hearings in Washington, and I guess that's a good thing, but they're looking at this as just from a certain perspective. They the events of like Point Pleasant or Skinwalker Ranch and such is not on their their list of things to look at.
Well, Brent, I curiously, I kind of feel for those people, because you and I and others know that there's so much beneath the surface. Mm-hmm. And I try to put myself in the position of, these government and military folks, some of whom may realize how diverse and, amazingly bizarre what's really going on is. And, in the light of the fact that this has been denied for over a half a century, where do you begin to disclose without risking the whole the whole kit and caboodle coming out? How do the longer the denial has been going on, the harder it is for any of the truths to come out. So, I'm not saying that I'm not letting these people off the hook, as it were, but I wonder how, even if they wanted to disclose, how can they do it at this point without um, upsetting so many apple carts?
Yeah.
And maybe that needs to happen, but how do government is in the business of managing reality. That's part of its nature, and so this it seems like an insoluble problem. I don't know. I'm just kind of venting about this. I really don't know what's going to happen. How much is going to be disclosed. Whether they manage to put the lid back on. I mean, the way that this goes is usually once every 10 years, something happens, like Leslie Kean's book, right? And this whole generation says, "Oh my goodness, UFOs," and then it's underground for another 10 years, and then a whole nother something happens, a whole nother generations. Oh my goodness, UFOs.
Yeah.
So
and there's rumors that the truth is about to be disclosed. It's about,
right.
Yeah, and these cases, military personnel having these experiences, they've been going on since the beginning,
Of course.
And it's really not anything new. It's
And we know, and it was all out in the open until from the 40s to the 50s. There was no mystery about it. I recall, growing up in the late 1940s in New Jersey, listening every night to a news commentator on the radio from New York, Frank Edwards, and he would just give these UFO sighting and landing reports. It was no big deal. I mean, well, it was a big deal, but this is before the curtain came down. And this was considered a proper subject for civil debate. And I remember one time I'm listening, and he reports a sighting and a landing near the Fort Dix military base, which was not far from where I was living in New Jersey at the time. And I was this kid, right? So I hear this report, and my first reaction was, "Oh, my people are coming back." Now, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So are people like us who are fascinated with these things? Are we from somewhere else in some other incarnation? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the Hopi Indians out there in Arizona would probably, some of them would, they believe that the Kachinas were from other planets, other worlds, and they drove flying saucers. I remember there was some sightings back in the 70s, 71, and there were some of the elders that were talking about that. Yeah, that's our people.
Yeah.
So maybe you got any Hopi Indian in your ancestry?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know about the Hopis, but there are two places in Arizona. They're 30 miles from each other. I visited both of them, and I can't be there. I have to get away. I discovered this the hard way. I was visiting one of them with a friend, and all of a sudden I start having this feeling of, I don't know whether it's a feeling of being in danger or something. It was just a really feeling of discomfort and almost pain. And I had to get, as soon as I got a little bit away from it, I felt fine. About 3 years later, I was in the same general area of Arizona, about 30 miles south of this first place. And I had a similar, very similar experience. I had to get away from there. And as I was driving away, I got a call from, actually it was my girlfriend back in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. I was traveling on my own. She'd stayed home, and she called me and said, "Dan, are you okay?" And I said, why do you ask? She says, I just had the feeling you were in terrible danger.
Hmm.
She was psychic. I already knew that, but
Yeah.
it didn't surprise me that she picked that up because I had this feeling of being in danger. So, was this a past life as a Native American where I came to a painful end or something? I don't know, but I do identify with that culture.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't Sedona area, was it, by any chance?
It was not far from Sedona. The first instance happened at a place called Montezuma's Well, or Montezuma Well, it's called. It's just off the freeway there, the north-south freeway that comes north from Phoenix. It's not I-25. It's one of the main interstates. Um, the Montezuma's Well, it's like a huge sinkhole, maybe 100 feet in diameter or so, and maybe 50 feet deep. It's got cliff dwellings in the walls, and there's a stairway you can actually go down, and there are the remnants of Native American fire pits and other things. And so that was the first instance where I was down in this sinkhole, and I had this feeling I got to get out. And the friend I was with actually had the same feeling.
Hmm.
The second place was, you familiar with the Arcosanti community?
No.
It was sort of a new agey community that was created by architect Paolo Soleri, Italian architect. It's a sort of a commune, and it's right off the freeway where the interstate branches off toward I think Sedona in one direction and Prescott in the other. It's that general area, and there's a canyon behind the community, and that's the place where I found myself that I just had this terrible feeling I had to get away.
Uh,
So it too is a place below ground level, interestingly.
yeah. I know there's a couple of people who have had experiences and told me about when they were in Sedona. Uh, they had unusual kind of disturbing experiences,
Mm.
and they attribute it to one of I think the quartz crystals
Hmm.
in Sedona seemed to affect them. Um, Interesting. I read in Frank Waters' book, Book of the Hopi, which I remember John Keel mentioned should read, and talked about the Hopis and the fact that the elders, the shamans, medicine men would use quartz crystals to look through at people and look at their chakras to determine, give them kind of health reading, and they identified really a lot of the psychic centers the same as
Mm.
like the Buddhists are said over in the East, the crown chakra, the third eye, and the
Sure.
throat and the heart and so on,
Oh.
which was I thought was quite extraordinary. Uh, yeah, got a little visitor here.
Ah.
Name's
Ah.
Yo-Yo.
Oh, what a sweetheart. What a sweetheart.
She keeps wandering in here. My wife come to take her back to the other room. But anyway, yeah, and I just thought that was interesting that and they identify with UFOs and such, and Native Americans. Some of those stories of different cultures, fascinating. Um, and I remember a psychologist who had been traveling in other countries saying that that was an area anthropologists were missing out on was
Mm.
the fact that some of these people in different cultures report, UFOs and feel a connection with them. But anyway, um,
Well, that's tough, for if you want to stay in good graces with the academic community, you don't talk about UFOs.
yeah,
And that's a shame, that we claim to be an enlightened civilization, and yet we have these taboos.
yeah, yeah. Um, but anyway, as I said that my I was really fortunate to connect with you as I was about to work on this book on
Mhm.
Keel and try to talk with people and interview people who had experiences with Keel and there you were going back to 67. And it was Nancy Talbert. She posted a video of you and this gentleman over in the Netherlands. You had been over there and you had been filming with him, and you used all these safeguards to make sure that this young medium guy who would predict where crop circles were going to appear got all these unusual photographs, even some of well, he did this for a lot of people. He would take pictures of their relatives, and he did this with Nancy. You know, she had pictures of her deceased brother. And I remember asking her, was there any way that he could have, you know, playing the devil's advocate, gotten a hold of these pictures? And she got mad at me there at first. You know, don't you think I know? I would know to, you know, safeguard against that, Brent. I'm just asking. So that was.
I think some of the you know, talking about Robert Vandenbroek, who's seen in my film Calling Earth. Yeah, I think one of the most evidential aspects of his work are the distortions that take place in the images. Some within a single image, you might have part of the image that's very naturalistic, and then you'll have distortions that cannot be accounted for, certainly by the technology involved. It would be extremely difficult to pull these things off with Photoshop. You know, anyone who's done photo manipulation or illustration can tell you right off the bat that you can't take a camera, snap it, have the picture come out with these distortions in it. They would take hours or maybe days to replicate with the subtlety and the detail that exist in these images. And sometimes with a combination of naturalistic and distortion effects in the same photograph. And you can see some of these in my film. Yeah, I was very careful with Robert to preclude any sort of trickery, and he didn't disappoint. And he also, I left out of the film, there was a certain amount of, he did some sort of spontaneous channeling for me, which I hadn't asked for, and including reference to a niece of mine whom I had hardly ever spent any time with, didn't even know her very well. And he said, he got her name first, and then said, yes, you'll see more of her soon. And in fact, that's what happened. There are other things like this that transpired. I was there for a short week, and I was very impressed. He claims that there are these ETs that are actually behind all these phenomena that go on around him, and he claims to have been teleported and so on. You know, I can't say one way or the other because I wasn't there. All I can say is that within the safeguards that I set up personally, he certainly performed remarkably, and produced those pictures that you can see in my documentary. And if people want to see the film, there's a short link. It's bit.ly/callearth, one word, CALLEARTH, bit.ly/callearth. And there's also a 5-minute trailer, which is at bit.ly/callearth-preview. Okay. So if you get a little taste of it there. But the film runs an hour and a half, and there's some quite remarkable material in it. And I hope your viewers tune into it and enjoy it.
Yeah, I think they will. And I know that when I communicated with Nancy early on, she was telling about first meeting this young medium, and before he really became well known, and she was focusing mainly on, I think, the crop circles, and she was there at the house, I think, on the second floor. Her bedroom looked out over these fields, and there was this bright beam of light that came down, she said, and you know, she was quite startled and ran downstairs, looked out, and I can't remember if the beam was still there, but she said the next day when they got up, they walked out there, and there was the circle on the ground there, right where she had seen the beam. So that was that always impressed me, that she had that experience, and then all these other experiences over the years. And she shared some of these photographs of beings and such, and then there was some that were almost, as I recall, like a cartoon character,
Mhm.
that would be like, there'd be Nancy and I think this young man's mother in the house sitting, and there'd be like this weird cartoon type character, and it just appeared in the pictures.
Well, the one of the most impressive ones that Robert did was this series of images, which Nancy just took a bunch of photos of an open field near where Robert lives there in the Netherlands. And when the pictures came out, they had each photo had included a representation of her late brother. And there were like at least a dozen of these, and each one was slightly different. And the representation of her brother was kind of abstract. It had a very curiously pointed ear on it. And she got them, if I remember her story correctly, she got the impression that he wanted her to play a particular piece of music that they both enjoyed together. And after she played the music, the ear went down to normal size in the next photographs that that were produced. And
Huh.
I may be getting the story slightly wrong, but it's something like that. And
Yeah.
Nancy did some tremendous work. Unfortunately, she suffered a stroke a few years ago,
Yeah. I
and
remember.
is out of the game. That's very tragic. But she did some very, very fine work in the crop circle field in general, and then also with Robert.
Yeah.
And it was through her she had arranged my visit to him, and it all worked out, really well.
Yeah. When I first, I remembered your name from the Mothman Prophecies, and I wrote to her after seeing that video, and I says, "Is this the same guy who is
Mm.
Keel's friend?" And she says, "I have no idea, but here's his email." So that's that's
Mm.
that's how that
Yeah,
developed.
that's how we connected. It's quite a while ago, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a few years, but it was yeah. And I hated that. I got to sit down. We were both speaking at a conference, a UFO conference over in Virginia Beach, Virginia, at the Association for Research and Enlightenment,
Mhm.
and just got to spend pretty much a whole evening just sitting there with her and talking with her and some friends about all her different experiences.
Mm.
Yeah, extraordinary stuff.
Yeah.
But so and also you, I picked up on watching your episode with Jeffrey Mishlove,
Mm.
and he had told me when he interviewed me about my book on John Keel, and he wanted to hear that story about the Joe,
Mm.
meeting him in Keel's apartment, and so I told the story as you had told me, and then he said that he had known you for a number of decades, I think 30 something years,
Yeah.
and always knew you to be very credible, and that was just a extraordinary account there, and but you also, I heard in the interview, were had a site where you had friends who were mediums, although when you spoke at a parapsychology conference, they tended not to like to hear those kind of stories, but you had found them to be quite
Well,
intriguing.
it was an interesting experience. Yes, I presented my film Calling Earth at a parapsychology conference here in Northern California that was sponsored by the Institute of Noetic Sciences,
Mhm.
IONS. And I've sort of learned the hard way that parapsychology, it really does its best to be acceptable to the academic community. And so if you can't put something in a lab and do formal experiments with it, so they don't want to know about it. Now maybe
Yeah,
I'm being a little unfair to them, but and as individuals they're interested, but as an organization they need to be very careful and as academically proper as possible. So anyway, I presented my film. We did a Q&A afterwards. And in the course of the Q&A, I mentioned these two mediums that I had been working with. And they're best known for having channeled the crews of the NASA space shuttles Challenger and Columbia, the two space shuttles that had been lost. And in the first instance with the Challenger, the first of the deceased crew to come through was the teacher. She was the trying to think of her name, I'm blanking on it at the moment. Krista McAuliffe.
Oh.
And she was the first one to come through. And I had also learned that she had come through to a number of mediums at the same time. She was obviously shocked, distraught, realized that she had died, and was mainly concerned about her kids and her students back home. And she came through immediately to my two friends that I work with, Jean and Regina, but also to others, as I say. And one of them happened to be in the room when I was doing this presentation to the Parapsychology Association. And after my presentation, she came back and talked to me and said, yes, Krista McAuliffe came to me too. And I had to send her away because her emotions were so intense that I could not deal with it. So, and that was, unfortunate, but interesting. In any case, Krista did contact other mediums, including my friends. This woman who came to me has herself since passed and has been in touch with me through my team of mediums. Yeah, these are two quite remarkable women. The website that we have created is called Cosmic Voices Network, and the link is Cosmic Voices, one word, .network. It's not .net, it's .network.
Oh,
so cosmicvoices.network, and it includes the page with the messages on it includes dozens of these messages that have come through this team of mediums. One of them, Jean Love, lives in Los Angeles, and she is herself a trained classical singer. She has an affinity for artists and actors and so on. And so folks in the Hollywood community that pass over very often contact her. I mean, she's apparently well known on the other side in that community, and they will often contact her shortly after they've passed. And a number of these communications are on our website. There's two columns of messages. One is names you might recognize, and there's another one's names you might not recognize. And some of those messages are quite interesting and intriguing. One was from the man who was the New York City fire captain at 9/11, who was killed along with his men on that day. And his message is quite amazing. So definitely, if anyone's interested in this sort of afterlife communication, and also to see the variety of experiences that different individuals have as they pass over, because there's as much variety in that experience as there is in our physical lives. Anyway, I won't say too much about it, but I would definitely recommend to your viewers to check this site out. You can also click on About, and you can see biographies of us, the participants.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And your new book, New Science of the Afterlife, is available on Amazon. And I mentioned we've probably touched upon a number of things that's in that book already. Is there maybe a kind of an overview that you might want to give our listeners as to what the book presents, and I'm sure it probably mentions about like what we were just talking about, the mediums and so forth, and how to look at it not as paranormal, but more as a natural phenomena.
Right. I think that's one of the core messages of the book. that we tend to pigeonhole these things as paranormal or supernatural. And when we arbitrarily label something supernatural, we're presuming to dictate the limits of nature. It's like we know what the limits of nature are. Well, sorry, we don't know enough to say that. From my perspective, it's all nature. I mean, there's nothing weird or spooky about it. Once you get familiar with these processes and the sense of the greater reality, it's all very natural. And I think the more the more we regard it as natural, the more we will be able to tune into these experiences in the positive way. The more we will be able to be comfortable with communication across the veil, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a natural process that we've just simply been cut off from, mostly culturally and psychologically. There's no inherent reason why this should be mysterious or strange. One of probably the longest chapter in my book is actually about language and how language tends to influence our sense of reality, and how we can begin to turn language around a little bit to be able to see things in a new way. One very simple example is, in our English language, we use words like somebody, nobody, everybody. And with every repetition, don't these words reinforce the idea that we're nothing but our bodies? Somebody, nobody, everybody. We're putting people in a box there. If we say someone, everyone, then we're talking about the one, the soul that inhabits the body, not so much the body itself. So there are little tricks of language that influence us and influence our thinking and our perception that I think we need to begin to look beyond these things. I have a lot of fun in this chapter with words, and one of them is with a phrase we'll call objective reality. Well, is there any such thing as objective reality? We tend to equate it with the materialist view of reality, that it's all just matter, which is itself strange because the physical world is more than just matter. It's matter, energy, space, time, but the whole materialist framework tends to focus on matter, right? As if all of matter were solid,
Yeah.
We forget about liquids and gases, right? So psychologically, we are focused on the most, on the most dead aspect of reality, you might say. The least energetic aspect of reality, which is, we would say, solid matter.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Well, it's just kind of reminded me of a book that Joseph Chilton Pierce had written some decades ago, "The Crack in the Cosmic Age," and a lot of the language, a lot of the things he was writing about was the language barrier, and how we're often short-circuiting our abilities with all the roof brain chatter, going on, as he called it. And he discussed about Aboriginal cultures and children, and how children are actually, often very psychic, but we condition their abilities out of them.
Yeah.
And I remember John Keel even kind of touching upon that, with like how many of these various cases of Virgin Mary apparitional appearances and how children were involved in so many of them, and that it, he felt children were often more attuned to psychic things, but it's conditioned out of us as we get older.
Right. Yeah, some of that is kind of natural. If you follow the best studies in reincarnation memory, we find that most past lives are remembered by children, usually under the age of 7. And they start when they're very young, and by the age of 6 or 7, when the mental faculties begin to develop, and the memories tend to subside.
Yeah.
So that's a problem we face, particularly with kids when we fail to recognize what they're reporting. And what does that do to them emotionally as they're growing up, to not have their experiences validated? You know,
Mhm.
the reincarnation case that I mentioned in my book of James Leininger, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is one of the most well-researched cases, modern cases of reincarnation. This young boy was born in Northern California. His parents moved to the southern states for work. Um, Before he could speak, he was having nightmares and drew pictures of air battles. And long story short, it turns out that he remembered his death as an American fighter pilot in the Second World War, who was shot down in the Sea of Japan near Iwo Jima. And once he could talk, uh, his father took him to an air museum, and young James was able to identify a particular airplane, the Corsair, an American fighter plane, and described to his father the features and shortcomings of this particular plane.
Wow.
Claimed to have flown one, and so on and so on. So his parents began to do some research in the military databases, um, and found that James really knew what he was talking about. James remembered the name of a ship, an aircraft carrier. He said Natoma. So his dad went online, looked at the Navy database, and discovered there was an aircraft carrier named Natoma Bay that was stationed in the Sea of Japan at that time.
Hmm.
Long story short, they tracked down a surviving member of his squadron who had witnessed James, the first James, also named James, being shot down. They took James to a reunion of surviving crew members from that aircraft carrier, and James recognized many of them. One of them by his voice alone,
Wow.
and he remarked that he felt sad because everyone looked so old. They also they were able to track down the sister of the original James, the pilot, who confirmed everything that young James was saying about his family. So many details about the family. So this was very well researched. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia Medical School did a whole major research project on this and wrote up a paper. It's footnoted in my book, and it pretty much nails the question of reincarnation. And it's amazing that we've overlooked this. Now, Ian Stevenson, who's also had been connected during his lifetime with the University of Virginia, investigated hundreds and hundreds of reports of reincarnation, many of them in the East, in India, where these things are accepted, and it's obviously easier to do research in that culture. And some people dismiss it. Well, yeah, of course, these people believe in such a thing. But his research was really quite impeccable and thorough. So, skeptics love to dismiss things on the basis of generalizations without actually investigating them. But that's not science.
Hmm.
So there's been some remarkable science applied in this field if you know where to look. And my book describes a number of these fields, one of which is instrumental transcommunication, communication from the other side through electronics, which has been going on since, as far as we know, since the 1950s. When in the 50s, that's when tape recorders first became consumer items. Mm-hmm. And occasionally people would hear voices on their recorded tapes that shouldn't be there. And initially, these things were dismissed as, well, maybe the machine's picking up a radio station. That sort of thing did happen from time to time. And in the United States, these things were pretty much dismissed in that way. But in Europe, a number of researchers and even physicists got involved in this research and did some amazing work. Friedrich Jürgensen, a Swedish artist and filmmaker, and well known in his time, He discovered this phenomenon on his own. He was out one night with his tape recorder recording nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary. And when he played back the tape, in the spaces between the bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. And he thought, oh, this is quite a coincidence, you know. And then not long after that, he heard the voice of his deceased mother calling him by his childhood nickname, Friedel. So at that point, he sort of threw up his hands and said, hey, we need to investigate this scientifically. So by the time he passed away, he had recorded many, many hundreds of these voices. His work was followed by that of Konstantin Raudov, a Latvian researcher. When he died in 1974, he had recorded between 60 and 70,000 of these voices. He actually put out a phonograph record with quite a number of these voices responding to his questions. And then Raudova and Jurgensen themselves began appearing as guests in their colleagues' experiments of communication from the other side. And this is all documented in my film Calling Earth. The film could have run 5 hours with all the material we had, but we cut it off at an hour and a half. But all of these experiences really point in the same direction. And to me, the bottom line question is, what's the veil? We speak about, the veil between this life and the afterlife. Well, in my opinion, the veil is our physical senses, which are just tuned to a very narrow slice of reality. We know that our eyes can only register certain frequencies of light. Our ears can only register certain frequencies of sound. Our physical touch can only register, a very limited number of phenomena. So, and surely the scientific instrumentation that we've developed over the centuries has enabled us to to see beyond the narrow window of our senses. It hasn't broadened our senses, but it's given us an important message, which is that what we think we know is not all there is to know. And that, people ask, well, where is the other side? Where's the greater reality? Is it off in some heaven somewhere? Well, when I address that question, I ask, where's Channel 4?
Or Channel 5. Yeah.
Or Channel 5. We swim in this sea of electromagnetic transmissions, wireless communications, radio, television, and yet they don't exist to our senses. Mm-hmm. They don't exist unless we have something that can resonate with them. And I think that when we do communicate with the other side, as it were, what's happening is our consciousness is kind of releasing its grip and opening itself up to a wider range of being able to tune into a wider range of frequencies. Mm-hmm. You're probably familiar with the classic problem in philosophy of monism versus dualism. Is mind and matter the same thing, or are they two completely separate phenomena? Well, this view kind of resolves that question. It's no longer either or. Matter may well be just a lower frequency manifestation of mind. This is what philosophers call downward causation, and it's confused with kind of crude creationism or biblical creationism. It's not quite that. It's the idea that consciousness at large is creative, and it can produce any number of levels of reality, including our own physical plane. Materialistic science believes in upward causation. It believes that that the smaller the particles you find, the closer you are to reality. So somehow these little particles, which aren't made of anything at all but energy, somehow they are responsible for this grandly creative act that we call the universe and everything in it. And that presupposes that the smaller, that the detail is responsible for the whole thing. And that's kind of like expecting, believing that if you put enough bricks together, the bricks can design a beautiful and structurally sophisticated building. Well, it doesn't work that way. Bricks don't have that inherent quality of intelligence and creativity and all that. And it's, in my opinion, it's the same with particles. Huge investments are being made in trying to smash the smallest particles into smaller particles to find out what they're made of. And it reminds me of a funny poem which I cite in my book, and that is, big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum.
Amen.
So where do you stop?
Yeah.
Where do you find God in the particle? I don't know. It's not my pursuit, but a lot of physicists seem to look in that direction. I don't think it works that way.
Yeah.
What makes sense to you in all of this?
I know that I look at kind of like what people are saying: quantum physics, non-local reality. The two photon particles. They can be wave, or they can be a particle, or depending on how they're observed, and how once they're two of them can be like united despite distance, supposedly. I mean,
that's a step. It's a step in the right direction, I think.
Yeah,
it breaks down the materialist paradigm.
Yeah, it shows that there's something real wonky about it. If we go by the normal scientific paradigm, really high strange.
Yeah.
And again, as you pointed out, high strange may be actually normal. We're just not looking at it that way. But anyway,
isn't life itself? If you believe that physical reality is totally mechanistic, which is the current paradigm, how do you account for novelty and imagination and so on, except by saying, well, it's all an accident?
Mm-hmm. And all these things that we see in nature that interact, the systems interact with one another, and these accounts of like a pet that gets lost on a vacation, but it travels 100 miles, 200 miles to get back to its owner. How did it do that?
Well, yeah, it's a how do birds migrate?
Yeah.
Well, it's been discovered that they can, they have magnetic materials in their brains so that they can orient to the Earth's magnetic field, but you can't navigate on a compass alone. You also need a map.
Yeah, I mean, they can actually be navigating over terrain they've never actually been to in order to get back to where they're,
Yep.
The ones before them went.
Yep.
Yep. It's a lot to think about, which most people just kind of too much for them to think about. But it's an area that we need to think about, and I find it fascinating. But there's a lot of people that want to just push it aside. And I had a young man, teenager, recently tell me that, Brent, they've proven that ghosts don't exist. I said, who proved it? There you go, listening to what someone else said instead of deciding on your own. But anyway,
yeah, I think I read something like that, and I don't know if are you familiar with the website skepticalaboutskeptics.org?
No.
Check it out. I think you'll love it. I have one of my old essays is on there. It's called Zen and the Art of Debunkery, and it's sort of a how-to guide for the irrational skeptic.
Okay.
And I had a lot of fun writing that.
I'm sure this will be our listeners will also be checking that out. And as well as your book and the videos, the documentaries. Well, I know I've taken up over an hour of your time here, and I really, it's good to talk with you finally, face to face here,
Yeah.
and review some of these ideas and these stories, and it's quite compelling. And I haven't read your book, but I'm going to. I've got to dig
Thank you.
into.
Thank you. I
So,
hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know, and maybe we can have another conversation sometime.
okay, I appreciate that. Sounds great. I'll do a review in my little book review section I have each month. So so anyway, well, thank you very much. And as they say on take care, and as they say on Ghost Hunters, at the end of each episode, on to the next. So
Next. Okay. Take good care, Brent.
okay, you too, Dan. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.